Welcome to War of the Words. I'm your host, Wayne Besen. On today's show, we discuss the Supreme Court's attack on the Environmental Protection Agency and how it's sabotaging efforts to fight climate change. Then we have part 2 of our interview with constitutional legal scholar Bryan Wildenthal. We'll talk about the overreach of the right-wing Supreme Court and the impact it's having on our lives. We end with my thoughts on America's deadly gun epidemic. What exactly is an environmentalist? Is there anyone that can live without a healthy planet? As far as I know, Democrats and Republicans are breathing the same air. We swim in the same lakes and eat fish from the same oceans. There isn't a Red Sea and a Blue Sea. Well, okay, there is the Red Sea, but I digress. Many Republicans are cheering because the conservative majority on the Supreme Court kneecapped the Environmental Protection Agency. It ruled that President Biden's EPA had little authority to regulate power plant emissions. Not only does this ruling make it more difficult to curtail the warming of our planet, but it also will lead to increases in asthma, lung cancer, and other respiratory ailments. But none of that apparently matters to Republicans because they accomplish their only goal, which is upsetting liberals. They are giddy because, as a study released in February shows, feelings of helplessness in addressing climate change has caused anxiety and stress, which is increasingly harming people's mental health. I'm assuming that most of those having nervous breakdowns over rising sea levels are Democrats, given that most conservatives are voting for politicians who are exacerbating the problem. In the beginning of this crisis, we called it global warming. We were forced to drop that name because every single time there was a cold snap, Republicans would foolishly scream, "See, it's not getting warmer. I'm wearing a coat. I've got goosebumps." In 2014, Republican Senator James Inhofe from Oklahoma actually brought a snowball onto the Senate floor as proof that climate change was a hoax.
We keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record. I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball. And that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal.
Thanks to geniuses like Senator Inhofe, we had to scrap the name global warming. Apparently, the concept was too sophisticated for Republicans, and they became confused when summer turned to fall. So the name was altered, and we settled on climate change, although climate catastrophe would be more appropriate. Despite right-wing screwballs with snowballs, NASA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration report that Earth's global average surface temperature in 2021 tied with 2018 as the 6th warmest on record. The past 8 years are collectively the warmest years since modern record-keeping began in 1880. The world's oceans are also suffering from climate change. They endured their warmest and most acidic levels on record in 2021, according to a study by the World Meteorological Organization. Their report states, quote, "It is a record that keeps getting broken year after year, and this could have a major impact on Earth's climate." That's not the kind of record you want to break, like winning a hot dog eating contest, for example. On the plus side, the clams will soon be steamed and ready to eat by the time you get them into your boat. Since the Industrial Revolution, the planet has already warmed an average of 1.1 degrees Celsius. If it reaches 1.5 degrees, it will cause cataclysmic heat waves, increased extreme weather events, and widespread species extinction. Christina Dahl, a climate scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists, said, quote, "The science is incredibly clear. Our failure to do even this small part as a nation is incredibly frustrating." It's perplexing to me that more Republicans aren't concerned about our future. Perhaps they own real estate in a clandestine right-wing colony on Mars that they're not telling us about. If that's not the case, they're going to suffer as much or more than the rest of us. The American West, which is primarily red states, is warming faster than the rest of the country, showing a 2.7 degree Fahrenheit increase. Summer temperatures in Reno, Nevada have risen to 10.9 degrees Fahrenheit on average since 1970, making it the fastest warming city in the nation. Those raging infernos in California? Most of them are happening in heavily wooded, mountainous areas that vote Republican. Lake Mead in rural Nevada is the nation's largest reservoir, supplying electricity to 350,000 homes and drinking water to about 25 million people. It has shrunk to about a quarter of its former size. Newsweek reports that if conditions don't change, the once robust lake will become a dead pool. According to the U.S. Drought Monitor, more than 20% of land in the western U.S. was determined to be in, quote, an extreme of exceptional drought. Utah is one of the most conservative states in the nation, and its largest metropolis is Salt Lake City. The New York Times reports that Great Salt Lake has already shrunk by 2/3. According to the Times, if this trend continues, the lake's flies and brine shrimp would die off. Scientists warn it could start as soon as this summer, threatening the 10 million migratory birds that stop at the lake annually to feed on the tiny creatures. Ski conditions at the resorts above Salt Lake City, a vital source of revenue, would deteriorate. The lucrative extraction of magnesium and other minerals from the lake could stop too. Most alarming, the air surrounding Salt Lake City would occasionally turn poisonous. The lake bed contains high levels of arsenic, and as more of it becomes exposed, windstorms carry that arsenic into the lungs of nearby residents who make up 3/4 of Utah's population. As their civilization collapses, at least they can take comfort in the Supreme Court ruling that sabotaged Joe Biden's EPA. Conservatives often defend dirty energy, like coal, by claiming such industries create jobs. But it's also destroying the environment. If someone offered you a paycheck to shovel nuclear waste into a river that provides drinking water, it's technically a job. Would you do that too? To justify their climate change denial, oil and chemical companies tried out bogus studies created by sellout scientists who were on their payroll. Isn't it fascinating how virtually all right-wing Republican climate science just so happens to bolster corporate profits? Kind of like how past research from cigarette companies conveniently concluded that cigarettes are healthy. You see, if you're smoking, you're relaxing. You're slowly inhaling and exhaling. If you view it from that perspective, it's practically yoga. Traditionally, another conservative priority has been maintaining a strong military. However, the Pentagon believes climate change will be one of our biggest challenges. CNN reports that a senior Pentagon official warned the U.S. military is not ready to handle climate change. Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks told CNN, quote, "We are not where we should be, and now is beyond the time when we need to get in front of that challenge." In the 2020 budget, the Defense Department devoted $617 million to prepare for climate change and mitigating its effects. However, it's clearly not enough. For example, 2 hurricanes, Michael in 2018 and Sally in 2020, caused $4 billion in damages at Tyndall Air Force Base and Pensacola Naval Air Station in Florida. Hurricane Florence in 2018 caused about $3.5 billion in damages and repairs at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and flooding at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska caused about $500 million in damages in 2019. The cost for replacing private property damage by climate change is an even greater issue. Conservatives downplay climate change because they often think that insurance companies will cover their damages. But the enormity of climate change's impact may eventually surpass the insurance company's ability to pay. If this occurs, first, the property insurance companies may look for reasons not to cover your damages, very much like how health insurance finds ways to decline necessary coverage today. These companies could eventually declare bankruptcy and leave you holding the bag. If you think lawmakers who receive major campaign contributions from these corporations will change the rules to protect you, you're likely going to be crestfallen. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the GOP base's penchant for religion as a leading cause of climate change denial. Many Republicans believe they don't have to worry because God will fix the problem. They seem to have learned nothing from their impotent prayers after mass shootings or their failed forays at Big Tent faith-healing revivals.
In the name of Jesus, come back to life right now.
I know they believe in miracles, but the last time God tinkered with sea levels was to help Moses escape Egypt.
God opens the sea with the blast of his nostrils.
Expecting a modern Moses sequel is probably not the wisest strategy to save the planet, but I guess that's why they call it faith. The Supreme Court's short-sighted attack on the environment was disgraceful. They myopically put their parochial political concerns before the health of our planet. It was bad enough when the court's conservatives tried to yank us back to the 1950s. Now they are trying to lurch us back 65 million years to the Cretaceous period, the era when the dinosaurs went extinct. If this court gets its way, we could be next. Joining us now is esteemed constitutional legal scholar Bryan Wildenthal. Welcome to the show. So you talked about the parts of the Constitution that you feel an affinity towards, but the Republicans in the Supreme Court today would say they're not deeply rooted. They're amateur historians now, apparently. Talk about this idea that they're going to dismantle all sorts of rights in the near future because they're not, quote, deeply rooted.
Yeah, well, what they're talking about with this deeply rooted idea is there are some rights and some Supreme Court decisions which have enunciated protections of liberty, which are not spelled out explicitly in so many words in the Bill of Rights. However, given that they have this very broad language in the Constitution, the 14th Amendment says life, liberty, and property shall not be denied without due process of law, equal protection of the laws. There's plenty of room in those broad, ambiguous phrases to uphold important constitutional rights. But when it comes to filling in the details, the right-wing Republican justices have argued that if a particular right taken in a very specific way is not historically deeply rooted, they won't protect it. And this is a deeply problematical approach. It is intellectually dishonest in many ways. It is hypocritical and it's ill-founded. It's a very complicated subject, but it is concerning. I think the current majority of the court may well proceed in bad faith and may well attack many of these rights.
You know, it's deeply rooted in this country: slavery, Jim Crow, the women not having rights, including the right to vote. They seem very selective on what's, quote, deeply rooted. If they like it, it's deeply rooted. If they don't like it, it's modern and illegitimate. That seems to be their reasoning.
Their typical response would be like on issues like, slavery and the denial of legal status to women. The Constitution itself has been explicitly amended to abolish those things and to reform those things. And so they say, oh yeah, so we're not going to adhere to that because the Constitution clearly rejects it. But where there's any ambiguity, where there's any open-ended doubt as to exactly what the Constitution means, then they fall back on a somewhat rigid, literal, narrow enforcement of historical understanding. So I think it is a deeply mistaken and deeply problematical approach. They do have a strong ideological agenda and a bias. That said, on some particular issues, there are some justices in the majority who have occasionally been willing to recognize and adhere to some rights. So Justice Gorsuch, surprisingly, has emerged as a fairly strong defender of the rights of Native Americans to enforcement of their treaties and their ancient sovereign status. And certainly no group of Americans other than Native Americans would have greater authority to speak about historical injustices. And I would hope that Justice Gorsuch would bring to bear the same sensitivity he apparently has on Native American and Indian nations' rights to, I think, also racial equality and the rights of African Americans secured by the post-Civil War Reconstruction Amendments and things like that. We'll see. He may be a hypocrite. Justice Barrett, I don't hold out a lot of hope for her. But outside of some areas where I think she's off the deep end, I think she may be reachable by reasoned historical arguments. Even Justice Scalia, who I always felt like Justice Scalia, there were a few issues where he was totally off the deep end. He was deeply homophobic, he was deeply committed to his religious beliefs, and he was zealously anti-abortion. On those issues, forget about it. He was unreachable, he was a zealot. On other constitutional issues, including freedom of speech, jury trial, and other issues, Justice Scalia often held the line and actually did defend important constitutional rights, often against some of his fellow conservative justices, and unfortunately, in some cases, even with some supposedly liberal justices on the other side of the issue. So justices, like a lot of people, are complex individuals. And I wouldn't want people to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to give up so completely on the Supreme Court that we end up in a place where 10 years from now, we essentially have no institutional Supreme Court left that anyone respects. We need to try to respect the institution, even as we stoutly and relentlessly criticize and call to account particular dishonest, zealous ideological justices. We need to try to draw that distinction. And although Chief Justice Roberts is not someone, frankly, that I would trust as far as I could throw him, I don't trust him at all. He's actually a very cynical political operator in many ways, I think. That's my observation. But he does care about the institutional standing of the court. And that's, I think, one reason why he chose to take a slightly more moderate approach in the Roe v. Wade reversal issue.
Well, if he cares about the court, he's probably pretty depressed right now. He probably needs like a gallon of Prozac. I mean, given how the standing of the court has plummeted in public opinion.
What Roberts wanted was a court just right-wing enough for him to do whatever he wanted to do, but not so right-wing that he's outflanked. He now finds himself outflanked by a 5-justice majority that's even further to the right overall than he is. The 3 liberal justices are obviously the most unhappy campers, and all of us who believe in the causes and rights that we care about, we're very unhappy for good reason. Chief Justice Roberts is also quite unhappy, and that could be useful because you only need to pick off one more justice in some cases to possibly hold the line. The other thing I would say is justices are appointed for life. And so if we do come down to a really severe test of the survival of the constitutional government.
I believe that they're part of the coup. I believe this is one of several coups that are taking place. And I think that they fundamentally want to create a different country from scratch than the one that exists. I think that they have theocratic leanings.
You're talking about the justices.
Yes, I think that these justices are extreme.
Some of them are. I would draw some distinction there. I think if you're talking about Justice Thomas, yes, he is truly a radical and he's dangerous. Justice Alito also, I think to a large extent, he's quite a dangerous justice because in some ways, Alito is even worse than Thomas. Thomas, at least like Scalia, has some sense of consistent principles, his own kind of twisted, rather extremist principles, but he has some consistency. Alito has shown a clear pattern, in my view, on the Supreme Court of voting in a very result-oriented way to achieve Republican political goals, even when it really goes against certain conservative legal philosophies or principles. Now, I'm not so sure about Justices Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, and Barrett. And in some cases, as I said, Roberts I see as an institutionalist who has not been willing to go too far in many cases. If the Trumpian Republicans are counting on the Supreme Court to help them implement a coup, I don't think they can count on Roberts. And I'm not sure they can count on Kavanaugh, Gorsuch, or Barrett. Now, clearly, there are a lot of cases where they are going to do damage.
We don't know for sure, but I would put my money on that they would support Trump in a coup. Those 3, Gorsuch, Barrett, and I think Kavanaugh, depending on how much he had to drink that day.
I hope you're wrong. Let me just say,
I hope I am too.
As an eternal optimist, I would bet you a good dinner and drinks over that because I hope when push comes to shove that we might learn that with life tenure, there is some deeper loyalty there. Now, again, on some issues, you're right. These people, many of them are religious zealots. So unfortunately, the separation of church and state is going to get trashed over the next decade. I've already internalized that. It's a tragedy.
Isn't that a coup in some senses? I mean, you're going to have Christian fundamentalists or Catholic Opus Dei types making the rules for everybody else. We didn't join their church. Apparently, they're giving us membership cards, whether we like it or not.
It's going to be bad. It's going to cause very serious damage and some very bad rulings. It's not necessarily going to affect every other area of law. Law is a vast tapestry of a lot of different issues. And so there are going to be some issues where I think you are going to see differences emerging among the conservative majority. I do see Thomas is a dangerous extremist. There's really no question. We now know that his wife was personally involved in a coup attempt, and we don't know for sure, but frankly, I don't think any of us would be surprised to learn that Thomas himself privately, personally was behind the January 6th coup effort. We don't know that. I guess he's entitled, like everyone else, to the benefit of the doubt. If we had a majority like Thomas, then I would throw in the towel and give up. We're not quite at that point yet. And I would just say progressives have an awful lot invested in having a Supreme Court left over. When all the dust clears, when we come out of this at the other end, if we don't have a Supreme Court capable of upholding the rights we care about, then we have lost a tremendous amount. Even if we have the presidency, even if we have Congress, if we lose that leg of the constitutional triad, That's an unspeakable tragedy for our system. And we haven't completely lost it yet.
I think we're teetering right now. We're on the precipice. This is a very radical court.
It is a very radical court, but we have not yet completely lost it. And so we don't want to further destroy the village to save it.
When's the last time, in your view, we've had a court this radical?
I think the 1920s and 30s, we had a court similarly, and that's been a century ago.
A while ago.
We probably need to put ourselves in our grandparents, our great-grandparents' shoes. They were pretty despairing back then. What they saw, the United States mired in a catastrophic depression, and a 5-4 majority of the Supreme Court at that time, based on bogus legal theories, invalid, legally erroneous theories of the Constitution, were striking down everything almost that President Roosevelt and a Democratic Congress were trying to do. I sympathize with Roosevelt wanting to pack the court because he's like, people are dying. The country is suffering a Great Depression, and these 5 old men, and they were all men at that time, on the Supreme Court were telling them that he couldn't change it. And so that understandably led to Roosevelt's effort to pack the court, but it was fortunate that enough of his fellow Democrats restrained him, because Roosevelt got reelected, Democrats kept winning congressional elections, and eventually, in the cycle of time, they were able to replace those justices, and we were able to build a more progressive court. I don't think where we are, as bad as where we are now is, I don't think it's clearly worse than where we were in the 20s. We came out of that with a Supreme Court that survived. So I guess maybe it's my bias as a law professor whose whole career has been about studying the Supreme Court, but I think there's enough there worth fighting for, and enough there that we can try to preserve.
Here's how it's worse, and it has nothing to do with the court. That the Republican Party has created a universe where people don't have to hear anything but lies. Fox News, you've got Ben Shapiro, you have these so-called think tanks, where it's more like they're thinking tanked by the way they write. And the bubble they've created, this impermeable bubble, I think creates a more dangerous situation where these wacky, crazy, outlandish views are viewed as mainstream by a lot of people in this country. And I think that's the difference.
Yeah, no, you're right. No argument for me there. You put your finger on it. It is, in that sense, we are at a much more dangerous place culturally and socially, because when big lies get propagated, and people are living in a bubble where they don't even hear the response, then it's very, very difficult to counter the big lie. The only solution is to double down and fight like hell, harder than ever, to try to counter it, which is what you're doing, and which I admire you and so many others who are trying to fight back against that type of culture.
And you're doing it as well. I mean, you're giving legal explanations to help people fight.
Yeah, we all try to do what we can in our particular fields. Those of us who are defending liberal democracy, although again, I don't, the other side plays hardball, and I don't want us to tie our hands behind our back or play too nice. But at the same time, when you are defending liberal democracy, that does impose certain constraints on how far we're willing to go. So I'm not willing personally to break the law or to trash the system in order to fight back or gain a temporary advantage, if we could, against Trumpian extremists. It's tempting, but I don't think it would work. And I feel like it would destroy what we're fighting for. It would literally be that we destroy the village in order to save it. And so for me, that's the great dilemma. How do we fight like hell as hard as we can to preserve the constitutional rights we have without bringing down the house on our own heads as well? That's a difficult challenge. It's a very difficult question.
It really is. We're at a disadvantage there because they don't believe in the rule of law anymore, and they're willing to do anything. And we're trying to stay within the bounds of law and reason. And that does make our task more difficult. Only a couple more questions. Vox had a story out about a case the Supreme Court chose called Moore versus Harper. And they explained it as a rule to allow state legislatures to have exclusive authority to set and interpret election laws. Vox called this case, quote, perhaps the gravest threat to American democracy since the January 6th attack. What's your view?
It is one of these maddeningly technical kind of issues. It's difficult to explain. It's obscure. Most voters don't have the faintest idea what it's about. But you're absolutely right. There is this theory which unfortunately has some plausible basis in the text of the Constitution, and it does have a historical and legal pedigree, but it is fundamentally mistaken. And the Supreme Court, in a number of decisions in the 20th century and as recently as 2015, has rejected this theory. The theory is that a state legislature controlled by a partisan majority of one party could attempt to regulate and control federal, congressional, and presidential elections without any pushback from the state Supreme Court under its own state constitution. It sounds crazy, and that's because it is, to a large extent, kind of a crazy theory. The response to this theory is that, again, the better understanding of the text and history are that this theory is bogus. This is very dangerous. It's very wrongheaded. It is a very dangerous threat because it would give partisan political majorities who control the legislatures in about 30 of the 50 states the ability to undermine our free and fair election system. The good news is Congress clearly has the authority under federal law to override whatever a state legislature does under state law as regard to congressional elections. And even those who advocate this theory that the state legislature is free to disregard its own state courts and its own state constitution, they do admit that Congress has the ultimate override authority. And that's why I say, for heaven's sakes, as the clock is ticking, before time runs out and Democrats lose their current majority, for heaven's sakes, override the filibuster, step in, and use this federal congressional override authority to block the worst potential excesses. And then hopefully we'll have to fight like hell to persuade the Supreme Court not to adopt this theory. But the same 6 justices who threw out Roe v. Wade that may well adopt this theory. So yeah, that it's an extinction level threat. It's a very severe, dangerous issue.
Take us through a hypothetical situation if this occurs. Tell us what happens. Let's pick the state North Carolina, for example.
Yeah, so what happens is a partisan majority in a state legislature decides to alter voting rights or election rules in some outrageous way that actually violates the state's own constitution. Ordinarily, the state courts in a state could push back because, after all, a state legislature doesn't come out of nowhere. A state legislature is created by the state constitution, and every state, just like the United States, has a system of independent courts and judicial review. The advocates of this theory say that when it comes to regulating federal elections, state legislatures are immune from judicial review and their own state constitutional limitations. And so it would render state courts powerless to prevent a rogue legislature from doing whatever the hell it wants. The only power that could step in, and tragically only with regard to congressional elections, not presidential elections, would be Congress. But we see how paralyzed Congress is.
And it could get worse if the midterms go to the Republicans.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If the midterms go the wrong way, then that removes, then the foxes are in charge of the hen house. Literally, frankly, we're screwed at that point.
Oh, the country's going to be fun then, let me tell you.
Yeah.
Final question. Who is this rogue court coming after next? What rights are on the chopping block? What will they dismantle?
I think the biggest, most severe danger is further demolition of the separation of government and religion. The current court takes such an extreme view of religious freedom that they view it as a get out of jail free card for any religious group that objects to any law they don't want to comply with. And so I really do worry that that's one of the biggest dangers, that claims of religious freedom would be upheld as an opt-out to who knows how many important criminal and civil laws, and that the current court will allow state and local governments to openly support and promote religion. Certainly, I also worry about voting rights. That's a severe danger. Affirmative action is on the chopping block for sure. I'm actually not quite as worried about LGBT rights, although certainly the way the transgender minority has been viciously targeted is deeply worrisome. I think that the LGBT rights movement has been successful enough and is not quite in the crosshairs as much as perhaps women's reproductive rights and these religious issues are. But I'm not suggesting that I'm sanguine about LGBT rights either. I just think that for those of us in the LGBT community, I don't see an immediate threat to marriage equality or the fundamentals of LGBT rights. I would note, for example, that Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Gorsuch both joined in a very strong 6-3 decision only 2 years ago to extend the Civil Rights Act to include LGBT people. The other area I'm very worried about is in criminal procedure. I think they may throw out protections against illegal search and seizure of evidence. That's another dangerous area where they could do a lot of damage.
In today's New York Times, they talked about the revival of Lochner versus New York. It's a 1905 case striking down a law that prevented bakery employees from working more than 10 hours and 60 hours a week. Could we see a time where we go back to this era, where this brutal era?
I think a number of the conservative justices would not be on board with that in a very fundamental philosophical way, because that also, in their philosophical mindset, that would constitute the court inappropriately expanding unwritten rights or rights that don't have a clear specific textual basis. Now, some of them might be tempted to go that way, but my best expert assessment as a constitutional law professor would be there's not really an urgent threat of a revival of Lochner.
Is there anything else you want to add before we end?
Yeah, I would just say just from my perspective as a law professor, I work every year with students who are, typically much younger than me, who are they're very idealistic, they're very committed. I always admire the passion and idealism of my students. What I tell them in class, I don't get into politics, of course, in class, but I tell them, don't give up. Don't surrender to cynicism or hopelessness or despair. This is your Constitution too. You've got a stake in this. Don't give up. Vote, organize, use the system. It's what our parents did, our grandparents who fought for equal rights. It's what they did. It's hard work. It can take years. You're going to have setbacks, but don't give up. I sometimes see too many progressives who just kind of want to throw up their hands and give up and say it's hopelessly destroyed. We might as well break up the country into blue enclaves. That's a recipe for disaster. The country has to hold together, or else the people we care about will suffer the most. And that's the tragedy. We've got more of a stake in the system than these ideologues on the right who are seeking to destroy the system. And they know that. And that makes our job harder. But it means we cannot give up. We cannot afford to give up.
Totally agree with you. Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate it, and answering these questions and giving some insight to our listeners and readers.
Yeah, it's always fun to talk. Thank you. And thank you for all your work, and always glad to share my thoughts. Take care.
Bye. The Second Amendment, as wrongly interpreted by conservatives, is an experiment that has failed. We have more than 400 million guns in the United States. That's nuts. Crazy people have access to weapons of war. I mean, did you see that loser in Highland Park? Yeah, that guy was able to get a gun legally. You okay with that? I'm sure as hell not. Here are the deadly results of our uniquely American madness. Guns are now the leading cause of death for American children, yet conservatives like to say they care about protecting kids and they're pro-family. Yeah, if you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you. There have been at least 314 mass shootings so far in 2022, but I better check the news. Another mass shooting might have occurred while I'm recording this podcast. Gun deaths are like the McDonald's hamburger sign. The numbers keep turning. We are a country where more Americans have died from gunshots in the last 50 years than in all the wars in American history combined. Let that sink in. If you're pro-AR-15, don't call yourself pro-life. You're not. To paraphrase the late comedian George Carlin, conservatives love you if you're preborn, but if you make it to preschool, you're fucked. But hey, at least we got your thoughts and prayers. That ought to help. If there's one thing that's consistent and defines today's MAGA Trumpian Republicans, they lie. They lie about everything. They lie about Donald Trump winning the presidency. He lost by 7 million votes. They lie about climate change. It's real, and it's happening now, probably outside your window. They lied about COVID, and people died. They attacked Dr. Anthony Fauci for doing his job trying to protect us. They lie about abortion. No, life doesn't begin at conception. That's a religious idea, not scientific. They lie about the Second Amendment. No, it doesn't give you the right to an AR-15. They lie about tax cuts for millionaires helping regular people. The result, a declining middle class and sinking wages. They lie about LGBT people every damn day. We aren't a threat to children, as they falsely say, but their right-wing churches have no shortage of pedophile scandals, and these conservative churches have paid out millions and millions of dollars to settle sexual abuse cases. So who are the groomers? The last Republican convention, for the first time in history, had no platform. Why? Because they stand for nothing other than pissing off liberals and grabbing power for the sake of power. We can do better than that. Do your country a favor and vote blue. Thank you for listening to War of the Words. I'm your host, Wayne Besen. You can check out our podcast on every single major platform, Spotify, Anchor, and Apple. Until we meet again, see you next time.